Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're looking at the key question, how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone? I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we have Natalie Foster with us here. Natalie is, I would call her an expert at work, future of work, particularly as it relates to platforms, and because of that, the sharing economy. You were a co-founder of peers.org, which we're going to talk about, and you are currently a fellow at the Institute for the Future. Welcome to the conversation here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good. Why don't we start, since peers.org, I guess, was a kind of an early player in this kind of space. So tell us a little bit about what that was and how it started and how maybe things have even changed from that time a little bit.
Absolutely. So we launched Peers about 3.5 years ago, back when Uber was still delivering black cars and no one had ever heard of Airbnb. Reporters were saying, how does this possibly work? We launched Peers to support people who worked in the sharing or the on-demand economy. Grew to about 250,000 people. And about 1.5 years ago, pivoted to be a company that supports the on-demand economy through products and services. And I think it's really mirrored the way the industry and the space has changed too. That when the term the sharing economy sort of came onto public consciousness, it was really about bicycles and drills and kayaks, and scooters, sort of how do we share our stuff? And what I think we've seen grow is more of the on-demand economy, the economy that says when I push that button, something shows up at my doorstep, whether it's a meal or groceries or weed or what have you. And those platforms have ushered in a set of questions around what work means and the future of work. And really, because all of that work takes place sort of outside of traditional employment and the traditional social safety net. And so has raised a lot of really interesting policy questions that have prompted a number of people to think about what kind of social policy do we need if work looks more like Uber.
So let's just explore that a little bit deeper, because you threw a lot out there actually very quickly, and I think for folks that don't maybe follow this, let's think this through. So it started like sharing things, so it was like sharing assets that we could use in common, but it was organized through platforms. Mm-hmm. And so then those platforms started to organize work. Is that the way you kind of connected to walk me through the evolution of how did we get to kind of the gig economy from sharing tools kind of thing?
Sure. Well, it starts long before Airbnb and Uber, right? Mm-hmm. People have been trying to think through new ways of ownership and new ways of consumption for a long time. And platforms and technology allowed us to reach beyond our immediate network and to start connecting with people whom we didn't previously know, but both of us had a drill or needed a drill. Mm-hmm. Or with car sharing at any given moment, somebody could access my car when I'm not using it between the hours of 9 and 5 while I'm parked at work, mm-hmm. that sort of a thing. So platforms, I think, really accelerated trends that had been going on for a long time in kind of alternative communities and economies. And I think two things we've seen, platforms as a technology I think are very interesting. It's really just the combination of GPS and payment processing and the internet that's in everybody's pocket that has allowed work and stuff and learning and skill sharing, all kinds of things to be sort of intermediated in a new way. I think we've seen two kinds of platforms grow over the last 3 years. One being capital platforms, so how people are exchanging, goods and services in new ways. And two being labor platforms, how people are finding work in new ways. Whether I am an Instacart shopper, or I'm cleaning homes on Handy, or I'm driving on Uber, or I'm task-rabbiting, or frankly, I'm selling my handmade goods on Etsy. There's a number of platforms that have sort of connected labor to work that needs to be done in new ways. Now, none of it's new. There's always been gig work and part-time work ever since, sort of the industrial age. Really, even prior to that, the farms certainly were all about gig work. But what's new is that sort of platforms are the intermediator, that there is ways of sort of judging trust and and reputation on the platforms. There's instant payment in many industries that have been informal for a long time. That's actually a step forward in industries that are sort of more likely to have wage theft and that kind of a thing. To be paid instantly for a job, is just one example of how technology has changed sort of the gig space.
So I like this distinction of kind of labor and capital. So you kind of gave an example of the kinds of companies in the labor space. So what about that capital one? Give me a little bit of a sense of what that is exactly.
Yeah, well, I think of the capital platform as Airbnb being one of the largest, certainly the biggest global player where people are obviously sharing rooms. But others would be Yurtle, where people are swapping items that they're finished with and sort of free shopping platforms, or Relay Rides, now Turo, which allows people to put their own car on a platform and someone else to access that car. Spin Lister for bicycles, and so on.
And would you, from your vantage point, call both of those sharing economy, or do you kind of, so for example, if you're doing Uber in this labor side of the equation, you're still often using your car, right? So you're kind of using your capital, but also your labor in a way that maybe you're not in the Airbnb world. You're essentially using your house, but less of your labor, although some of your labor to get it ready and clean it up and that kind of stuff. So could you talk about that distinction? Is that still considered sharing economy then, I guess, the labor side of things?
Well, look, you're asking a question that no one has the answer to. And if there had...
If anyone does, so you could maybe.
I could say that there's probably been no more contentious term over the last 3 years than the term the sharing economy. I think it's universally disliked by people of all political stripes and policymakers of all political stripes, whether it be taking notion with the idea that it is not sharing, it is commerce, to the idea that, so on and so forth. So I think it is all related to ways technology is changing the way people interact and the way people do commerce, for sure. I think sort of the on-demand economy or the gig economy has emerged as a term that reflects more of the labor platform side of things, and the sharing economy sort of reflects more of the capital platform side of things. But at any given moment, you can find someone who uses them interchangeably.
Interesting. Okay, so that's really helpful actually. And so you started really deep in this, although you have roots in it before peers.org. But over recent years, you've also been migrating to kind of more the future of work and thinking more about that second sector, maybe? Is that safe to say, when you're doing your work with the Future Institute of the Future, and the Aspen Institute has been more in this other category?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right.
So talk about that evolution of your own thinking into that space.
Well, I come out of politics and technology, and so when it became clear that some of the questions posed by Uber and folks who work on Uber actually were very similar to folks who have worked outside of the social safety net for years, it became clear there was a moment to think about broadly as a society, what does the social contract look like? For a very long time, we have placed all benefits and protections through employers. You had to have a W-2 full-time job in order to be eligible for workers' comp, unemployment insurance, paid time off, health insurance, so on and so forth. And anyone outside of that traditional employment system is on their own. So I think of my father. He is a retired minister, and a few years ago, he and my mother picked up their earthly belongings and moved to Colorado to be near their first grandson. So my father hung out his shingle as a handyman, fosterhandyman.com, and he gets a lot of his customers the old-fashioned way through word of mouth and joining the Chamber of Commerce, but he also uses Thumbtack, a new digital labor platform that connects people who need their homes painted or odd jobs with someone like my father. And, he loves it. He's his own boss. He can work whatever hours he wants. It's very flexible. He sets his own wages, but he's totally alone. There's no employer paying into, unemployment insurance or workers' comp or any of the safety net that we have created to support people. And in that way, he looks a lot like an Uber driver. He looks a lot like somebody who works on a digital labor platform. And he looks a lot like people who are, highly paid computer engineers, freelance artists, independent contractors, nannies, people who clean homes. And so anywhere between 10 and 40 million Americans are in these alternative work arrangements outside of the social safety net. So given the rise of labor platforms like Uber, I think it offers us a chance to rethink how, what does a social safety net look like for the 21st century if work is fundamentally changing?
Before we jump into that, which I will definitely want to get into, which is the bulk of it, we'll be talking about this 10 to 40 million folks. Let's talk about the size of that and the growth trajectory. So, any sense of how 10 or 20 years ago that looked, if it's grown till now, and where it could go? Do you have some kind of ways of thinking about that?
Yeah, so I say 10 to 40 million because there are a number of studies that have conflicting numbers and frankly just not enough understanding. Even in the census that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, we rarely look at contingent work. We only look at sort of employment. And that is changing this year as the Department of Labor has understood this is a real problem to not understand how people are actually working and has taken that on. There was a recent study out by Katz and Kruger saying that that all new job growth essentially over the last 5 years has been in alternative work arrangements. So that's about 16% of Americans are now working in alternative work arrangements. And while the absolute number by many accounts is pretty low in terms of number of Americans who are doing that work across the labor market, what's interesting is the rate of adoption. So the JP Morgan Chase Institute just put out a really important study looking at a number of people's bank accounts and their actual income, where it comes from, what kind of digital labor platforms it comes from, the percentage, the size. So they found overall it was very small, but there was a 46x growth over the last 3 years. And so when we're thinking about the future, it's not necessarily the absolute numbers we should be paying attention to, it's the rate of adoption. And that says to me that policymakers and people who care about the society and the tech industry have to come together to think through, if this is the new norm, or even potentially the new norm, what sort of social policy will we need?
So you'd say something, if I heard you right, 16% of the American workforce, would that be the way to think about that, roughly?
Yeah, that 16% of the American workforce are in some alternative work arrangement.
And when you say alternative work, you meaning contract work? Or
yeah, independent contractor, freelancers, people on the gig economy, anyone who has a 1099. I mean, there's a number of ways that it's categorized. Whether it be through tax law or through sort of labor law.
Do they count, I'm just curious, do they count people who actually have a core job but also do 1099 work on the side? Because it seems to me, I would say 16% seems low to me, just knowing what I know. Maybe it's because I'm in the media world or something.
Well, and the Upwork and Freelancers Union have a study out that says 40 million Americans, right? 16% I think is around 10 million Americans, was what Katz and Kruger just said. That's the most recent study. A year ago, Freelancers Union and Upwork put out a study saying it's 40 million Americans. So that's why I say the numbers vary wildly. And it's a real problem that we don't have a great understanding of exactly the question you asked, right? If you have a traditional job, then you are counted as an employed American. But any of the alternative work you do on the side isn't necessarily captured in any other way other than 1099 taxes you might pay. And none of that data is available to the public through the IRS. So I think this is something that Mark Warner, who has established the Future of Work initiative at the Aspen Institute, have been talking about. He's written a letter at him and a number of lawmakers saying this is something that we really have to figure out. And I think the Department of Labor has also recognized that and is working toward making sure our census and our other counting mechanisms start to really dig into how people are working.
So you mentioned Warner, you meaning Senator Mark Warner from Virginia. And you mentioned this Aspen Institute thing, but explain a little bit more about the project that you're talking about there that he's apparently heading, or he's co-heading or something?
The honorary co-chair, yeah.
Okay, and you're involved in that?
Yes,
so
yeah.
I'm
a fellow there, and that for me started. I'll say the Aspen Institute Future of Work initiative was established to be a year-long, nonpartisan commission that looks at solutions to the changing workforce, both fixing capitalism and thinking through the gig economy. And so about 8 months ago, I started organizing with Lenny Mendonca, a former McKinsey partner, a group of people who were sharing economy, on-demand economy CEOs, as well as labor leaders, to think through, is there common ground here? Both supporting the innovation that's happening in the digital labor platforms while recognizing the vulnerability that people have who work in those arrangements. And so the CEOs of Etsy and Lyft and Instacart and Handy, as well as labor leaders like Saket Soni, who runs the National Guest Workers Alliance, or Palak Shah at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, David Rolfe, who's from traditional labor, runs the SEIU, the Service Employees Union up in Washington State, Andy Stern, who I believe is someone you have talked to, as well as people like Anne Marie Slaughter and Douglas Aiken, from the left and the right politically, to say, here are design principles for what a new social contract might look. Here are design principles for modernizing our social contract, given the changing nature of work. And so what was interesting there was not just what it said, but who was saying it. And prior to that, it had been a very polarized conversation. This is good or this is bad. And I think it's become very important to look for the common ground between that supports sort of the flexibility, and the insecurity of the work.
So let's just talk about that a minute here about this, the good and the bad side of it, because a lot of times some people see it, say, "Oh my God, this is horrible. It's the direction of the economy doing this." Yet you mentioned your father's situation, and I think a lot of other people's situations, they welcome that kind of flexibility. So talk about the pros and the cons of this a little bit, and then we'll get into some of the solutions here. In other words, you don't want to push everyone back into the old way of being an employee, just to give them all those safety things, because that's not really what a lot of those people want, right? I mean, they like the certain things about this new arrangement.
Well, here's what I'll say. Even if we wanted to say, let's bring back the middle class jobs, the unionized jobs that built the American middle class, that one would do over the course of their career, they would retire with a pension, they would have access to the benefits and protections afforded through employment. They would, their wages would go up and up as profitability went up and up. Like what we saw sort of in the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. Even if we wanted to say, let's go back to that, which I think if we could, maybe we would, we can't. The last 40 years of the American economy have shown that work is shifting away from protected jobs that are good jobs that one has for an entire lifetime, and toward the service and retail sectors, toward minimum wage jobs, toward jobs that try and schedule you right at 29 hours so as not to have to pay for your health care. And that is the biggest employers in America right now are places like fast food outlets, and not the car factories of Detroit of yore. So I don't think we have a choice to go back. What we do, sort of the adage is change is inevitable, but progress is not. And what we do have a choice is to say, as technology shifts work, what kind of social policy do we need for this new way of working, where it won't be with one employer necessarily? You might have a few jobs throughout your lifetime. You might have a few jobs at any given moment, together. And so how then are you protected in that scenario?
But without, just to clarify one thing on this though, but it's not so much how do we make salvage a kind of a bad situation. There is an element of this evolution that is a positive thing. For example, I'd be horrified if I had the same job for 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of changing job every few years is awesome for me. I mean, so I mean, there's a side of this I just want to kind of get from your perspective, as you touched in with all these people. Like, are people wringing their hands and screaming, we hate this? Or are they saying, we like it, but there's stuff that's not working, we got to fix it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There are a number of people who've chosen the freelance work. I mean, the Freelancers Union, I think, is a great example of an organization that supports people who have chosen to do flexible work. but need to have a way of, prior to the Affordable Care Act, needed to have a way of accessing health care, which again, prior to Obamacare, people could not, it was very, very difficult to get health insurance outside of a traditional employer. So in some ways, the Affordable Care Act has really ushered in what may indeed be the beginning of an era that decouples benefits and protections from traditional employment and instead affords them to everyone regardless, of how they work. So I think it's just important to know, it's easy for people to say, people don't want employment and they want the flexibility. And I think that's true for a set of people. And that is not true for another set of people. And so I think that we can have both flexibility and security.
So talk about the principles then of that kind of idea, because we're in a period here where it's the very early stages of this rethink. How do you make sense of this white space? Like what are the, Obamacare is a good example of how we start to see some traction, but what are the other elements that people have to start thinking about if we're going to do a fundamental rethink like that?
So one place to start will be with benefits and protections. But again, that's only a starting place in terms of how we rethink social policy for a new kind of work. And with benefits and protections, I think it'll be important to figure out how we make them portable, prorated, and universal. So meaning portable, meaning no matter where I work, if I am moving from job to job every few years, or if I am moving from job to job every few hours, that my benefits and protections go with me. Portable. Prorated, meaning if I work on this platform for 6 minutes, if I'm driving, someone from here to there over the course of 6 minutes on the Lyft platform, and then maybe I go clean a home on Handy, say, that it can, it's not all or nothing, that I can build up my benefits and protections in a prorated way. And universal, meaning that not some companies opt into this and others don't, sort of contributing to the Walmartization of this space, but that in fact it's a universal playing field and sort of a stable playing field that platforms understand these are the new rules in which we operate. So portable, prorated, and universal social safety net.
And that would be, from an American perspective, essentially a federal level changes, or I guess could you do this at a state level, or I guess a city level even, or no? Yeah,
so at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative, we just released a paper called the Portable Benefits Resource Guide, and it really digs into how one might move this forward. We fundamentally think there needs to be a federal change, but that is probably years off in the making, and in the meantime, states and cities should prototype new policies that support this kind of thinking. So I imagine New York State doing something. In fact, I'd say the first mover in this space was somewhat surprising. It was Uber. So a few months ago, a new guild was launched by the machinists called, the machinists are the traditional labor union that represent black car drivers in New York. They have for decades. And they launched the Independent Drivers Guild to support Uber drivers in New York. And Uber has recognized that guild. Now, next year, the plan is for that guild to offer benefits and protections to Uber drivers in portable ways, and Uber would, pay into that. And so that, I think, provides us a model of what this could look like. There's still a lot of details to be worked out, but in terms of first movers, I think that's an interesting one.
It's interesting that it's Uber too, who takes a lot of hits from people on not liking to play ball here, but that's a really interesting example. So you mentioned benefits and protections. Maybe elaborate, because the benefits, I see that. When you say protections, what do you tell them more about what that would look like?
So I think with protections, it's a question of what does workers' compensation look like in an era of gig or fragmented work, and what does unemployment insurance look like? There's sort of interest around a job seekers allowance right now that supports sort of retraining while people are looking for new jobs, or if I am between gigs, what's the thing to make sure that I can sort of, eat between work.
So you got this initiative at Aspen. You got Warner kind of pushing this in the government. You mentioned also this your work at the Institute for the Future. So what was the Institute for the Future doing around this kind of stuff?
So the Institute for the Future has launched the Workable Futures Initiative. And there we're really looking at what kind of design principles are needed for platforms to be positive platforms. So in many ways, we think a lot about the customer side of things. How do we reduce friction? How do we make it very easy for a customer to use any one of these platforms? But what often people forget is that this is not just a terms of service, it's actually the new work contract that many platforms are creating. And so how do you apply those that same design thinking to the work experience? How is it? So for example, if a tip jar is eliminated because it's creating friction on one side of the market, that has a huge impact on my take-home pay on the labor side of the market. And so how do we make sure that platform design is done in a way, basically marrying platform design and labor economics to say we need a new way of thinking about platforms if they are to be in fact the way work is intermediated in the future.
So someone who might not be familiar with the platform, so when you say a tip jar, you meaning you're taking an Uber or you're taking a taxi and you don't want to have two ways of calculating, to pay, and it's all kind of just one seamless interaction. You're saying that makes it better for the experience of the user, but it also cuts out a potentially, a significant amount of money for the worker. That's what you're meaning by
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Right. Just that any sort of point along the payment transaction is something that has huge impacts on platform dynamics, right? People fall off. We know anytime there's another step, you get a huge percentage of people who sort of fall out of the transaction. So a lot of focus is put on that because that's the money-making side, but just remembering that in fact, any change has huge impacts on the people who do the work on the platform. Their ability, even things like prioritizing the 1-800 number for me as a customer to call in with a complaint. But we've heard stories where there will be hours waiting for somebody who's calling in on the labor side, trying to say, I don't feel safe in this place. This X, Y, or Z happened, or you actually messed up on this last thing and only paid me $2 when I was supposed to be paid $12. And so, how do we make sure that it works for both sides of the marketplace?
Interesting.
So one part with Institute for the Future, it's one part positive platforms, another part ethnographies of who's doing work on platforms. There's a lot of talk right now on Uber and Handy and Instacart, platforms that are sort of primarily minimum wage platforms, but there are new platforms moving into doctors and nurses and real estate agents, and moving into spaces that have traditionally been white collar. And sort of breaking that work down into tasks and routing it in new ways. And so who are the kinds of people doing that work? What do they need? What do they get from it? What do they not have? So really cutting edge ethnographies into people who are working in new ways.
Fascinating. Now we've been talking about this labor side of the sector, I guess, of the broadly defined sharing economy. Do you have any reflections on the part that's sharing assets or sharing capital side as you described it? It seems to me there's another kind of fundamental rethink there where we and it's often in city regulations. So we had hotel laws basically on fire hazards and health and safety things around that. And now we have how do we think about home sharing? Or you mentioned a little bit around the taxi thing, but have you ever thought about, do you have any reflections on how that has to be rethought, or is that equally as kind of fundamental a rethink we got to be thinking about?
Absolutely. Ultimately we built a set of laws with a distinction between the commercial and the personal. And, a set of licenses you had to get if you were to become sort of the commercial operator of something. And that line has been tremendously blurred given the rise of technological platforms and people wanting to interact in new ways. And so I think all of our regulation has to be thought through in a new way. And then what's interesting is over the last several years, as you've started to see the beginnings of new regulation, you also see the unintended consequences that come with that. So I think it'll be an iterative period to sort of try out, this is the law, here's how we do home sharing in the city. And here were the unintended consequences of that law, so let's fix it in this way. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me we wouldn't get it right. But I think it's good that cities around the world are figuring out how to both support the innovation and also create basic set of protections and a level playing field for everyone.
Well, how do you think about that? Because I mean, are we? How's that going for us? I mean, do you feel that there's a kind of a couple of things. Do you feel we have a window here of opportunity to really get this right, and that if we don't, we might kind of get bad laws, bad regulations, bad things kind of locking in? Is there an opportunity there? And also, well, actually, let's just talk about that right now. Because you watched the growth of this, like 5 years ago, people wouldn't even know what we're talking about. Now we're kind of at this place where there's these unintended consequences. There's this, significant part of the economy now starting to shift this way. What do you think about the time frame we have here to kind of play with in terms of figuring out this next set of the social contract and the next set of regulatory rules?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, first of all, no one can predict the future. We're very, very bad at that historically. But we can design for, I think, maximum flexibility in how things, in scenarios, in different scenarios for how things might play out. I mean, I think we've seen a much larger growth and rate of adoption of a lot of these platforms in cities across America than anyone would have guessed. Just even looking at the labor side, right? Growth, 46x growth over the last 3 years of people doing some work on a digital labor platform, primarily in cities, primarily on the West Coast, although that is shifting. It's hard to know, will that curve continue? I mean, there's a lot of people making bets in Silicon Valley that yes, that curve will continue up. And so I think it is important that we start to build policy that supports the innovation and protects people. And at the same time, we take time to do it right. We make sure that it's not just one side or the other of the table, but it's actually the table of all the different people who are impacted by any given technology.
But so like you as a kind of a person in the mix of this, when you see, like a city ban Airbnb completely, or, in Austin we recently had a situation where car sharing just pulled out. What does that say to you? Does that make you worried about this kind of process, or does it make you, what's your thoughts about those kind of things?
I think that, I think that fundamentally banning any of this is probably not going to work. I think that the genie's out of the bottle, and that people are earning income in new ways, and that's a very powerful constituency. And people's, lives are made much more expedient in other ways, which is also a powerful constituency. And so you have two sides of a marketplace who generally really want something to exist, but they also want it to exist in the right way. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a right way for home sharing and a right way for, on-demand car services to be set up and a wrong way. So I think creating the rules by which everyone plays is a very smart thing to do.
Do you think, how clear is the way forward in those two sectors, for example, given someone who's been immersed in this space? Is it, hey, we got a lot more kind of creation, innovative work ahead of us, or it's like it's pretty clear, some consensus starting to move, or I don't know, where in this space are we, you think, in terms of figuring this out?
Well, look, I think the consensus we've been able to build around what kind of a social contract we need to support people who work in new ways is an example of the kind of consensus that's possible to build if all parties are working with one another. And that's not historically been the case. Historically, it's been a very polarized conversation where often, you'll have a tech company come in and just decide to build the market as fast as possible, that it's all about growth. And at the same time, you'll have worker advocates who are working on a whole number of things, from the worst of sort of workplace abuses to wage theft to a minimum wage that does not support an American family. And then all of a sudden having to deal with the impact of a new technology in their space. So I think in an ideal world, you'd have a table of people who support work and people who build the technology, and then you'd figure out this policy together. But we don't live in that ideal world. That's not the way politics are done. It's not the way regulation is passed. And so I think you're seeing that patchwork across the board, where you have cities who are banning a lot of things, but cities who are coming up with hybrid models, and so forth. But what's interesting too is that I think a lot of this has also prompted, in Seoul, for example, you have a city that said, we don't need any new taxis. We don't want Uber here, but we like what this technology is doing, and we're going to build our own technology that the city will run and operate that looks a lot like an Uber. So you can push a button and get, a car to your house. So I think there's interest in, will it work? I don't know. But I think that is worth trying.
That's Seoul, South Korea?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. That's interesting. But is there, but I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing we got a messy space in front of us here, but is there, maybe even around, let's say, the folks who really deeply understand this space, is there some ideal that's kind of getting more and more concrete, both in the labor side and maybe the home sharing side or the capital side, that we can kind of shoot for, or does that work still need to be done? Like we don't even know really what's an ideal set of regulations to shoot for, or an ideal social contract to figure out. I mean, are we still on the figuring this out? Not the political side of getting people into it, but the actual conceptual work of what would work to make these markets work for everybody, basically. Yeah. That's what we're trying to figure out here in this series.
Look, I think in many ways we, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we figured out what are the things people need to be safe, to not be discriminated against at work, to have a basic minimum wage, to have safety standards, in place. We figured out a lot of that within an employment context, and that's how we built our entire regulatory system. So the question in my mind is not sort of what do people need, but how do we translate a lot of what we know people need to this new space that looks very different, where there is not one employer, but there might be many, where people are, finding work in new ways. What would sort of a non-discrimination law look like, for example, in an Airbnb context, where you have, Airbnb not intermediating and deciding sort of who stays with who, but in fact individuals deciding who stays with who, and bringing to that decision their own sets of prejudices and discrimination. What does non-discrimination look like in that scenario, right? And so I think that's one of the future questions to answer. What does workplace safety look like if there is no workplace? Today on my way over, I had a Lyft driver who had a set of gloves on. He had built a little homemade cardboard thing to go around his smartphone that presumably was to keep the glare from the sun, so he could always see the smartphone. He was building essentially his own safety standards, his own workplace, but that workplace was his car, right? So what does that mean for the future? I mean, these are really tough questions, and I'm glad there are smart people thinking about them. And certainly with minimum wage, we've built minimum wage to be an hourly understanding, but we don't work in hourly increments anymore. In fact, we often work in seconds or in minutes. So it shouldn't be that hard to kind of prorate, but yet that is not any sort of regulation that we have on the books. So I think that'll be the real challenge. Where we've seen the most progress is on kind of the benefits and protection side of things, saying yes, we could build a prorated and portable social safety net that allows people to have paid time off, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, that kind of a thing. But it gets a lot harder when you move to the safety standards and so forth. And I will say one other space where I think we're very far behind is on food. So I think that'll be the next big set of questions. We have home sharing, we have cars, and food will be even more complex, because those regulations were built for a very good reason, right? So to protect you and I from.
So again, thinking about people that might not totally understand this space. What do you mean? These are the people that are getting food to your house from a kitchen someplace, in maybe an individual's kitchen or something, right?
So, certainly
Explain to it.
Yeah, so certainly that. Well, let me just tell you the story of Josephine. It's a platform that's out of the East Bay, and it's essentially Airbnb for food. So if you, Peter, are an excellent cook and you're making lasagna tonight,
No, I'm not.
let's just in this hypothetical world,
Yeah, exactly.
you would say, I'm making lasagna tonight. I am making 16 portions. Who wants them? And I could come on and order 4 portions for my family. I'd go to your home between the hours of 6 and 8. I'd bring a container. I'd pick it up. And I'd take that home and feed my family with your lasagna. It's very popular. It's grown tremendously. I'm a consumer of Josephine living in the East Bay.
Okay.
And a couple of months ago, the health and safety inspector shut it down. They said, this is not legal. People are doing work cooking in their own kitchens, which are not commercial kitchens. Now, Josephine had a whole set of standards that they made sure they actually went out and inspected every single person's kitchen. They had a whole set of standards that sort of mirrored the traditional commercial standards, but were more applicable to their scenario, where it is cooks who aren't professional, cooks. So this will be a really important question. I believe that we as a society can figure out ways using data. In any given moment, Yelp can tell you where a greatest outbreak of food poisoning is much faster than a health and safety inspector at some county, right? And so how could we equip that health and safety inspector to do her job using the data that something like Yelp has? I think there's ways of thinking about regulation, as Nick Grossman at Union Square Ventures calls it, regulation 2.0, that helps folks do their job while using the best tools we have. Because I think there's some misnomer that actually people who think there are important and good aspects to the on-demand or the sharing economy just want to do away with all regulation. And there might be those people. But there's a whole lot of people who also think regulation has made this country what it is today and protects all of us. And so how do we modernize it?
So regulation 2.0, it sounds like a core part of that is these new ways of trust, learning trust, right? Again, from your vantage point, maybe talk about how that supersedes the need for, you alluded to it with the Yelp, but just walk someone who's not as familiar with the space through why this trust and rating system actually can act as a powerful kind of regulatory tool in a way that having a, bureaucrat walking into the thing and looking with their own eyes, it's actually better, or at least equivalent in some ways. Can you explain how that would work?
Yeah, so for any given interaction on a platform, both sides of the marketplace are asked to evaluate the other side. So the consumer is asked to evaluate how good was the service? Did it work for you? What did you like about it? And the person who did the work was asked to evaluate how good was that customer? Did they treat you properly? Was everything okay? And from there, you can tell if there are problems. Now, I think there is a lot of good that comes from that. So there's sort of a thought that the reputation system is sort of the new CV or the new resume for people who do digital work. They're able to build up a number of recommenders. One tricky thing is they aren't able to take that with them anywhere. So, I build up a strong reputation system as a host on Airbnb or as a driver on Lyft, but it doesn't port over to Handy, where I might be cleaning homes. So that, I think, will be one interesting question, if that is in fact the new resume, how I take it with me. But more than that, it allows people who otherwise would need someone to vouch for them to then just be able to say, 40 other people thought this person was great, I will think they're great as well. And then decide to hire them or work with them. So it's essentially a vouching system. For in the old way, you'd need to find someone who knew them. In the new way, you can look at what people have said about them and make your own judgment call. And with that comes a lot of questions as well. Like, for example, when somebody who is having a bad day doesn't like me and gives me a 0, that has a huge rating effect, a huge impact on my ratings. And for many platforms, if you go below, let's say, a 4.6 out of a 5 rating, you're off the platform. And it's not like there's sort of an HR department one can go to and plead one's contest, you know. And so I think that this will be another question. What kind of arbitration is needed for someone who's working in this new way to say, hey, actually, that wasn't fair, or this was a misunderstanding, or explain the case. You know, I think certainly it works for just getting bad actors off the platform quickly, but for anything in the middle, it's a lot harder. And actually, one of the things we've seen Lyft and Uber both have talked about, and in some court settlements have actually said they'll be setting up arbitration panels of drivers who will decide if other drivers are in fact, you know, should be kicked off or should not be for those cases that are in question.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's evolving in real time here. You mentioned that you made some reference to the geography. You said it's, for example, in the sharing economy space, saying it's, I forget exactly how you phrase it, but the West Coast, more of a West Coast phenomenon, although it's increasingly moving to other parts of the country. And then also I would potentially, how it works globally. Is there any, talk a little bit about that. So are we seeing the most advanced form of it here? And if so, here, meaning we're in San Francisco here, but on the West Coast? And if so, what are we learning? And then how do you see it diffusing here in the coming years?
Well, one thing we know about digital labor platforms is that it is spread across cities primarily in the U.S. and with the greatest concentration on the West Coast and then the greatest concentration in San Francisco. So in many ways, you know, the Bay Area, both home to a lot of the platforms and then home to the largest number of people finding work in these new ways, is well equipped to be taking on a lot of these challenges and leading on the policy questions, even if that's not necessarily happening yet. So that's sort of the distribution we know in the U.S.
And how is San Francisco doing in terms of the early stages of this, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have yet to see a proactive approach to how we set up, you know, for the thing I think about is what is a prototype of this prorated and portable social safety net? What does it look like? We've seen first steps in that direction. So just a few days ago, the chief economist of San Francisco laid out a report that examined what kind of gig work is happening in the city of San Francisco, digging into a lot of the problems I was talking about earlier with the lack of data, be able to use IRS data, that sort of a thing. We know it's still a small percent of the labor market across the board. It's not in any way like everyone is now an Uber driver. And a lot of critics or a lot of people will say, well, in fact, that's why we shouldn't be talking about this. There's outsized attention spent on the sharing or the on-demand economy. And, you know, that might be true right now, but I fundamentally think it's shining a light on something that is not new and that is very big, which is people working outside of, you know, alternative work arrangements. So it's worth having this conversation now, even if it's spurred by Uber, it's not, you know, just Uber. So San Francisco has a ways to go, and the state of California has a ways to go to figure out, you know, how we might update our social safety net. But I think we've seen, you know, some early signs.
Any other places you'd point out to as doing particularly well in thinking this through or working on this? Other cities or states? Or anything?
In New York, there's something called the Black Car Fund, and that was set up several years ago to give taxi drivers as well as Uber and Lyft drivers workers' compensation. And the way it works is every ride in New York is charged a fee that most consumers have no idea they even pay. And that fee is given to the Black Car Fund, which administers workers' compensation if someone were hurt on the job, if an Uber driver or a Lyft driver were hurt on the job. And so, you know, you have this revenue that's built that goes to a third-party organization that supports people who work in these new ways. And so I think that is a really helpful example to a lot of us to say, okay, here's a model where the mandate is created, and it doesn't even have to be necessarily a government program. In this case, it's administered by a third-party organization, you know, with an appointed board and that sort of a thing. And one could imagine expanding that out to sort of being a marketplace where individual workers choose the thing that they want, that sort of a thing. But that ultimately it's a state or a federal policy that sort of creates the marketplace or the playing field or the rules.
Okay, as we wind this down, I mean, you associate with the Institute of the Future. You're thinking about the future of work. we've been talking in a very tactical way about the sharing economy, the gig economy, but there's also looming out there self-driving cars, AI, robotics.
That's right.
How much of this do you think is laying the groundwork for era with that, or is that, or talk a little bit about that juncture as well, which is probably not too far ahead.
A portable and prorated social safety net is the kind of policy we need for when we have Uber drivers, essentially. But anywhere between 2 to 9 years, Ubers will be driving themselves. We actually have Uber prototyping self-driving cars on the road in Pittsburgh. Every Tesla sold is essentially an autonomous vehicle. And even, many say trucking is the first place where this will start to move forward. You've had caravans of autonomous trucks drive across Europe doing all of the loading, the packing, the shipping, everything with robots. And so when work is done by automation and by robots, what then do people do when there's not even the wage opportunity to be supporting them? And that's led me to the universal basic income, this old idea that's having a modern resurgence that basically says we should give everyone unconditional cash transfers for being alive, and that is the floor from which they start, and then they can do the work they want to do from there.
So we had a very long conversation with Andy Stern on this concept in his new book, but just to kind of, as you're wrapping up your conversation here, do you see a continuum of, as we get these portable benefits, and then we get an increasingly kind of automated kind of future, that it flows into a kind of a universal basic income and kind of, as well as benefits and other things around that somehow? That kind of, I don't know, I'm just kind of trying to connect those two strains a little bit. Is that a continuum, or is that kind of two different things at some level that we're going to somehow align somehow?
Look, fundamentally, I think when we left the farms and we went to the factories, we created entirely new norms for the way we work. We said, I want the weekend, 8-hour workdays, this is minimum wage, and thankfully, children don't belong in factories. Mm-hmm. I think we are on the cusp of needing to rethink the norms of the way we work today. And that will mean everything from portability and proration all the way out to, and if we are producing record profitability at the macro level, but people don't have jobs, thanks to automation that we've created, how then are people living? And perhaps we should just cut everyone a check. So that entire rethink of essentially the social contract, was rethought at the dawn of the industrial age, and perhaps needs to be rethought today for entirely new ways of working. And fundamentally, I think giving everyone money is probably the ultimate portability. And if we're in an era of great mobility, that would be one way to solve for it.
That's interesting. And I like that historical analogy, and it resonates for me too, but it's interesting, when you really think back on American history, there was a kind of what they call it the progressive era. It was about 1900-ish to about 1920 was that explosion of getting rid of child labor law and health and safety, and you name it, was basically came into that. And then I guess it could have rolled into the 30s a little bit, but anyhow, it was about a 20, 30-year rethink, depending when you put the end posts. What do you think we think we're in for that kind of period? We're talking decades here, kind of to figure this probably all out.
I think two things. One is that given we've been here as a nation before, could we do better, right? Can we do it without shedding blood or without horrible protests on the street and horrible unrest that kind of came with that period? We knew it took both worker advocates and titans of industry to come together, and policymakers to push something forward. But the people who do the work had to have power in that scenario, as did the people who were creating the work. And I think it's the same for today, which is why I've worked to make sure that in any given scenario we have platform creators along with worker advocates together figuring out what the path looks like. So I'm optimistic in thinking we could do it in a much more seamless way than was done last time. But I also recognize that that these things do take time. In fact, it takes time to recognize kind of the era you're in. Often it's much easier to look back and say this is what it was, and I think it's possible we'll soon realize we've actually been in this space for quite some time. Work has fundamentally changed. This is actually not about the future in many ways. This is about the last 5, 10, even 40 years, where you've seen American wages stagnate or decline, but yet you've seen record profitability at a macro level, and where all that's gone in the middle, is something that we have to figure out, or we won't be able to have the same sort of life that this country's had.
I like that a lot, and I would just put a little coat on that, is that economic transition I think we're seeing in politics now, breaking out on the Trump phenomenon, the Bernie phenomenon, that kind of it's roiling right now, I think, in a way, and partly I think it's because of this undercurrent of really fundamental economic technological change that's really happening today. So I very much agree. I mean, whether it be Britain leaving the UK and then saying, wait, why did we do that? Or whether it be, Donald Trump. I think it's a time of great upheaval. Yeah, completely right. Well, thanks so much for spending the time here and laying out these ideas. I think they're really important. It's a lot of people trying to wrap their head around it, and this is a very helpful kind of hour we spent kind of getting it figured out with you. And I want to say yet another really great interview that actually is laying down the foundations for a different understanding of the sharing economy in a way that we can figure out how this gets to work for everybody.